In the previous video, we've created the test and the implementation for the database execute method. In this video, we are going to create one for inserting records to the database. Now, before we do anything, what I want to do, because we are going to be using this database instance throughout this test, basically for pretty much with every method we're going to create here, every test. So what I'm going to do is it's basically this instantiation needs to go to a setup method. And setup method, if I just click on this test case, which we are extending from within this database test, and then for this PHP framework test case, and if I look for setup method, you'll see this is an empty method, but it allows what it says. Basically, it sets up the fixture. For example, open a network connection. This method is called before a test is executed. So every time we run each of these tests from within any of the test class, this setup is being called. So what I want to do is basically override this method. So protected function set up, and what I'm going to do here first is to call the parent one. So parent set up. So if there is any method, obviously we know that within this PHP unique framework test case, it's just an empty setup method. But if we wanted to create one setup method for all of the tests, let's say we want to do something that all tests require before each test, then we could add it to this test case class. But obviously for the time being, we don't need another setup method here. We only need one for our database test. So what I'm going to do is move this instantiation of the database object to our setup. Once the parent setup has been executed, this will also be executed, and we will have database instance associated with our private database property. Okay, now obviously we can probably rename this method because we're no longer creating new PDO instance. So let's just remove this part and leave it only with executes simple query, because that's what it pretty much does. So next method we're going to create, next test, is going to be public function, and it's going to be called inserts new records. There we go. And let's straight away indicate that it's a test. I'm just going to scroll up a little bit. So it's a test, and I'm going to create a few new lines here. And the first thing I'm going to do is create the result variable and associate it with whatever the method called addBook, method which we don't have yet, is going to return. And then I'm going to run my assertion. So this assert true, and we pass in the result through as an argument. And the second argument will be the message saying the insert statement failed. And let's put on 2 new lines. There we go. Let's now run a test, PHP units, and obviously we fail because this addBook method does not exist. Okay, let's clear it. Go back to the editor, and what I'm going to do now is, rather than adding this method directly into our database test file, I'm going to create a directory called traits under the unit directory and extract all these helper methods which are interacting with the database into its own trait called, if I just create a new file, called bookstore. There we go. And what I need to do is, before we actually do anything, let's open composer.json and add it to the autoloader. So what we have here is for the class map, we are going to add tests /unit /traits, and we have bookstore.php so that it can be autoloaded. Now obviously what I need to do is go back to the terminal and run composer dump -autoload, and let's run it optimized. So -o, and there we go. That generates optimized autoload file. So now this bookstore is going to be included in the autoload. Okay, let's go back. And bookstore, what we are going to do, obviously that's not a class, that's a trait. So let's change this. And the first thing I'm going to do is to add this protected function called addBook. And it will take array as an argument, which is going to be called user_data, by default empty. And then the first thing I'm going to do is to check if this DB, which we're going to get from whichever classes using this method, this trait. Insert method, obviously we know this insert method does not exist. Let's create a new line, and within this insert method this insert method basically will take 2 arguments. First one will be the table name, so it's going to be in this case books, and the second one will be the data that we are passing through. And to pass the data, I'm going to use this and book data. And then for this book data method, which does not exist obviously at the moment, we are going to pass this user data. So basically this book data method will have some predefined, it's going to return an array basically. It's going to have some predefined values associated with the basically with the database table fields. But if we want to overwrite any of these default ones, which will be basically fake values, we can use it by basically passing this argument to this addBook method and override them this way. Okay, so here, if insert return true, then what we want to do is this last insert ID equals this db last insert ID. What we're doing here, we obviously need to add this property, so let's add it quickly here at the top. It's going to be protected last insert ID, and it will be of the integer type. Okay, so that's this one. What it will do, basically, we obviously don't have this last insert ID either on this database object yet. We will create it a little bit later on. What it does, basically, once we've inserted record, what's the last ID of this record? What's the ID of this record? So we can later on compare when we're doing any assertions within our tests, whether it matches the ID of the record that we were hoping to add or update on the database. In this case, obviously add, because insert will return this last insert ID. And after that, obviously we return true, because this returned true in the first place. That's why we were able to actually associate this, the result of this last insert ID with the property last insert ID. After all this, after this if statement, return false, because obviously if it failed, that's what it would return in the first place. Okay, I'm going to add doc block here as well. And what we're going to do here, let's say add book record. And that's pretty much it. Now, one thing we obviously don't have is this book data, but data I'm going to store separately. So I'm going to use another trait, and this trait is going to be called, because we're going to be using this trait in other tests as well. This one is going to be called model data. And inside of this one, and again, that's a trait, so trait, what I'm going to do before we do anything, I'm going to go back to this bookstore and make sure that we're using this trait. So use use model data. There we go. And now this one will have this book data method. So let's go back to this model data. And what I'm going to do here, first of all, I'm going to create this method. So protected function book data, and it takes array called user data, by default empty, and let's leave it like this for now. We will work with this in just a moment, but before we do, what I want to do is to create a new protected property called faker. We set it by default to null, and then I'm going to create a protected function, basically a new method called faker as well, and we'll check here if is null this faker. Then what I want to do is to basically instantiate it. So faker equals factory, faker factory, create. There we go. And that's all I need. And let's import this factory. Obviously, this is one of the packages we installed earlier. And now we are going to simply return this faker property. So we always, by calling this method faker, we always get instance of the faker, in other words. Okay, so again, let's put the doc blocks here, and this one here is not going to be just null. Let's do it like this, so null or generator, because that's what we're expecting it to be. By default there's null, obviously. Okay, and then what can we call this? Let's get faker instance, and this one will be get book data. Okay, inside of this book data now, what we're going to do is, and again, I'm going to create a few new lines so you can see a little bit better. Inside of this book data method, I'm going to return this merge data method, and this merge data will take two arrays, basically two arguments. First one is the array that we are going to generate using Faker, and the other user data. So if we want to overwrite any of the fake data, we will be able by passing this user data argument. Okay, let's create this merge data. So protected function merge data, and it takes first one is array data, and the second one is also array user data, by default empty. Now this merge data will first check if isn't empty user data, then merge it with the main data array. So data equals array merge data and then user data. And after all this, let's return data. So basically, we are going to create some fake values here, some testing values basically, as the first array, and then we are going to pass the second array. So if we want to overwrite any of this, we will be able to by passing this argument. If user data is not going to be empty, then basically user data indexes will overwrite the ones that we've set using Faker here. And then we're going to return the array. Okay, and it's going to override them as long as they're going to be string indexes. Obviously, again, array merge, if the indexes are of the integer type, they will be appended to this array. Okay, so for the fake data, what I'm going to do is start with a category ID field, which this books table will have. And we start with this Faker number between, and now we're going to have number between 1 and 10. It's basically going to represent the ID of a category, basically to which with which book record could be associated. Now a Faker, if you're not familiar with a Faker, it basically generates random basically random strings, integers, dates, and so on. Basically anything that you can only imagine, pretty much. So if you want to run tests, it's fantastic for testing, because obviously you don't always want to be strictly typing certain values. Faker is going to generate them on the go, and you can basically obviously use it this way. So category ID, then we have ISBN, which will be this Faker, and we're going to use ISBN. It's got 2, 10 and 13. 10 is going to be just fine. Then we have year. We want to generate some year. This Faker year property. And then we have title. This Faker. And we're going to use words method. We want 3 words. And we don't want them as the array. We want them as string. So we need to set the second argument as true. Then we have description. This Faker sentence. Then we have price. This Faker random float, and we want 2 decimal places. Now before we go any further, let's add the return tag here as well. It returns array, and let's add dog blocks for this merge data. And what it does, it merges data, so merge data, simply pretty much the same as the method name. Okay, so all that seems to be working fine. Now if you go back to the bookstore, you can see our book data is now available, because obviously we are using this trait, so book data is no longer highlighted. If we go to the database test, we don't seem to be having access to this add book yet, and this is because we obviously not using this bookstore. So use bookstore. There we go. If we use this trait now if we scroll down, this add book is no longer highlighted either, and we can click on this and go straight to this trait method. Okay, now this model data isn't going to be available until we add it to the composer. So composer autoload def with the class map again, and we are adding this time model data. What we need to do, I can now save and close this, go back to the terminal, and let's run composer dump -autoload optimize to generate the new autoloader, which includes these new traits. And I think that's it. If we go back to the terminal PHP unit, and we obviously are calling this insert method on a database instance, which does not exist. That's why the error. And let's work on this method in the following video.